Welcome to this new episode of the Philosopher's Stone interviews on the past, present, and future of human understanding. It's a true honor and privilege to be joined today by one of the most distinguished philosophers of our time, Professor Timothy Williamson. And Timothy is a Wickham Professor Emeritus of Logic at the University of Oxford and a Professor at Fellow at New College. He has held visiting positions at Yale, MIT, Princeton, and a number of other leading institutions, and is fellow of both the British Academy and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. His work spans epistemology, metaphysics, philosophical logic, and the philosophy of language, and is known for his depth, rigor, and originality. Among his most celebrated contributions are his books Knowledge and Its Limits, where he introduced the influential Knowledge First program in epistemology, and The Philosophy of Philosophy, a deep work on the nature and methodology of philosophical inquiry. Tim has consistently challenged received ideas with precision and clarity, offering new ways of thinking, amongst other about logic, vagueness, necessity, and the foundations of human knowledge. And today's interview, of course, will explore some of these themes while also reflecting on the evolving role of philosophy in our rapidly changing intellectual landscape. So, Tim, thank you again for being with us today. It's truly a pleasure to have you. And to begin the interview, I'll pose a question that seems simple at first glance, and the question is, what is philosophy?
Well, philosophy is a kind of intellectual inquiry. It's a kind that has evolved over thousands of years in several different traditions in different continents. And as a result of that, it's not something that one can define in any simple, accurate way. But it's probably better to start with examples. If somebody is asking what is knowledge or what is justice or even more radically what is then they're probably doing philosophy, and it's a subject which tends to operate at a fairly abstract, general level. So, for example, when philosophers ask what is knowledge, they're not just concerned with what human knowledge is like in practice, that they're concerned about any kind of knowledge, as well as human knowledge, the knowledge of non-human animals, maybe these days even the knowledge that artificial intelligence might be able to have, and they're concerned not just with what knowledge happens to be, but what it is necessarily. And one way of thinking about its position in relation to other kinds of inquiry is that philosophers have, as it were, some typical skill sets which are a bit different from the skill sets of other people engaged in other forms of inquiry, although I mean their skill sets also differ from each other. But I would think if one was going to emphasize a couple of things in the case of philosophy, one might emphasize on the one side the role of logic in philosophy, but also I think the role of imagination, of being able to imagine possibilities that are very, very different from anything that we've actually experienced. And so as it were, the kinds of question that would now be considered philosophical are the ones that can be answered in those kinds of ways. But I think this difficulty of defining philosophy is it's not just as it were philosophy that's so hard to define. It's hard to define sort of any discipline, as one might say, and for similar reasons, because they've all evolved over time, and they show some of the marks of that history in the way that they operate. And I think it's important to emphasize that there are many different ways of doing philosophy. So there's a great deal of diversity in it, but I'm not suggesting that all ways of doing philosophy are equally good. I do think that some are better than others.
Thank you, great. And yes, and this leads to our second question. And what is the difference between philosophy and science?
So the quick answer is none, because philosophy is a science. And in saying that, I'm using the term science not in a sort of narrow way that just covers the natural and social sciences, but one in a broader way, which covers, for example, mathematics, which is neither a natural nor a social science, and also a history, which is not really a natural or social science. And so within the realm of science, there's a huge amount of variation, and philosophy falls within that range of variation, but the sorts of things that, very broadly speaking, that it has in common with these other subjects is that other sciences is that it's, as it were, a critical, systematic, evidence-based form of inquiry. And I think one can see how close it is to all the sciences by looking at specific areas. So, for example, if one's doing philosophy of language, then what one's doing will be very closely related. In fact, will overlap with linguistics. If you're doing philosophy of physics, you'll be engaging in kinds of inquiry which overlap with what goes on at the most theoretical end of physics, so that you can have joint conferences with philosophers of physics and theoretical physicists. If you're doing philosophy of mind, for example, philosophy of perception, you'll want to know about experimental results on perception from psychology, and if you're doing philosophy of mathematics, you need to know some mathematics, and at the level of very foundational issues in mathematics are discussed by both mathematicians and philosophers of mathematics. So I think in whatever area one looks, and just another example, that if people who are doing the metaphysics of time, they will need to know about the physics of time, about for example, special relativity and so on. And so philosophy is not separate from science. I mean, it's not that there's any one science that it has to imitate. Its methods are not exactly the same as those of natural science, for example, because philosophers are not mainly doing experiments or making measurements, and it's not exactly the same as a social science, because philosophers generally are not concerned with gathering statistics, although all of those activities can be found in a minor way in philosophy. So I think it's simply, as it were, part of the broad spectrum of science, but within that spectrum, it has its own somewhat distinctive features. It just in the way that other sciences have their somewhat distinctive features.
Thank you very much. That's fascinating. And so we now move to our third question, and the question is, what good is philosopher, and what is the public and scientific role of philosophy today, and how is it changed compared as when you started your career?
Yeah. So, I mean, philosophy is good wherever. Of course, we're concerned with with questioning very well embedded assumptions that have been taken for granted. It's where the philosopher is often the person who's asking awkward questions. Again, this relates to the sort of boundary between philosophy and physics, so that some physicists find their way into philosophy because they kept asking questions in physics lectures about why something is the case, and then when they were given an answer, but asking about why about that, and then eventually they would be told, look, you should be asking a philosopher, not a physicist, and so as it were, somebody should be asking these why questions, and one role of philosophers to do that is to do that. I think that it's worth emphasizing a specific way in which philosophy is sort of, as it were, valuable within the wider kind of intellectual economy, which is that philosophers are unusual in how willing they are to discuss value questions of good and bad and right and wrong in an open, explicit way. I mean, in a lot of areas of science, people are sort of obsessed with the fact value distinction and feel that they shouldn't be discussing value questions because that wouldn't be scientific. But that's something that philosophers have been willing to do, and so that, as it were, and they do it in a systematic, critical sort of way, and so that those kind of normative questions of value that really need to be discussed systematically. One of the best forums for doing that is philosophy. I mean, I think that's far from the only role that philosophy plays. I think it also provides a variety of potential coherent world pictures of us and our place in the universe that are secular and so available to people who are not convinced by any of the answers that the religions have to give. And so in that way, it's sort of feeding curiosity on a grand scale. I think it's because it operates at quite an abstract level, it often takes quite a long time and various levels of mediation and popularization before philosophical ideas have a practical effect. But they do in the long run have a practical effect. I mean, for example, the idea of human rights comes from philosophers in the 16th and 17th century, and has had a huge effect. I mean, another example where the effect was actually much more immediate is that I mean, whether one approves of it or not, but the effective altruism movement started really with the work of of philosophers like Derek Parfit here in Oxford, and has had a massive practical effect. It's led to a lot of people giving large chunks of their income to charity. Just to give another example, of course, with the development of artificial intelligence, one of the questions that what one has to ask is what is intelligence? Are these programs or machines really intelligent, or are they just, as it were, good at simulating intelligence? And the question, what is intelligence, is an absolutely typical philosophical question. So that philosophy sort of contributes by its ability to respond in a kind of objective, more or less, systematic, reflective, critical way to these questions of fundamental importance.
So, dear Tim, what is the main difference between the way philosophy was conducted when you started your career and today?
So I don't think there's been an absolutely radical change, but it's certainly become more international. So that, for example, philosophers in China and Japan and India are much more part of the as well the same conversation as philosophers in Europe and America than used to be the case. And I mean that's a very welcome development. I would say that there's been an increase in how much broadly scientific philosophy there is, in the sense that I was explaining before. And by that I mean philosophy that is more rigorous, but I mean partly more rigorous by using logic, but also more rigorous in being informed by relevant developments in the natural and social sciences. And it's probably also become, in some ways, it's become more connected to the general public, in the sense that there's more of a literature of popular philosophy than there used to be. That's still reasonably well connected with academic philosophy. But on the other hand, there may be fewer philosophers who sort of occupy the position of a guru, but that's probably a good thing, because we don't really need gurus. We need people who encourage a more critical way of thinking.
Okay, thank you very much also for this interesting picture. And we can now move to our second part of the interview. You have dedicated a significant part of your career to studying the logic and epistemology. And so let's turn to this topic, logic in particular. And so my question again is, what is and what good is logic?
Yeah. So logic is very often defined as the study of the validity of arguments. And sometimes it's defined as the study of consistency, which is kind of equivalent, because you can define consistency in terms of validity and validity in terms of consistency. So as it were, that would make it the study of what conclusions follow from what premises. I think actually that that's too narrow a definition of logic, and quite a lot of logic doesn't really fit into that. So on the more philosophical side, there's quite a lot of logic, I think, is actually just concerned with finding very, very broad structural generalizations about reality. And so, for example, a relatively trivial one is that that everything is self-identical. And if properly understood, that is an absolutely universal and necessary law, but it's not about validity. It's just a general truth. And another one, controversial, but I think quite defensible, is the law of excluded middle, which says that everything either is the case or is not the case. And so there's a part of logic which is in a way, I think, more basic than the study of validity, which is just the study of these general structural features of reality. And then for historical reasons, because logic, again, like philosophy itself, has a long and complex history, there are parts of of logic that are basically mathematical. So set theory, for example, the study of infinite sets, that's part of logic, but it's mainly done in mathematics departments. And computability theory is another branch of logic, which studies issues about what sorts of programs can be, what sorts of problems rather can be solved by a computer program in a finite time, and things like that. And in fact, that's related to one of the most important roles of logic in the contemporary world, which is in connection with computers. And the development of the first universal computing machines was something that emerged out of particularly Alan Turing's solution to a problem in informal logic. And so as it were, logic was the basis for the computers that we're using now to communicate with each other, and for everyone who owns a laptop owes a debt to logic. Another way in which logic, I think, has is absolutely fundamental, is that logic supplies the background forms of reasoning that are used in all mathematics. Although they're not kind of highlighted very much when by mathematicians, but in fact you can work out what principles of reasoning mathematicians use, and those principles are codified in modern logic. And so mathematics depends on mathematical proof, and mathematical proof is founded on rules of logic. And so all the areas of science that depend on mathematics, which is pretty much all of science, indirectly depend on logic. So it occupies, a very central position in human knowledge, even though it's quite often it's kept in the background, but it is in fact there and operative.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And my next question is, what is the public and scientific role of logic today, and how is it changed compared when you started your career, if any?
Yeah, so of course, logic, as I've just said, it plays a big role in the background in mathematics, and it plays a big role in the foreground in philosophy. But I take it you're mainly interested in the more sort of general connections of logic. So I think one way in which it's changed a bit is that it's the connection with computer science has grown and grown, and so these days, if you look at a logic journal, quite a high proportion of the the articles in it will be written by people in departments of computer science. And although I mean, logic is also significant in mathematics, but I would say that as it were, the mathematical connections haven't been quite as active in the last few decades as they were earlier, and the connections with computer science probably have been more have been growing faster. I I think one thing that logic is good at doing is prov providing applications where people need to be quite formal in their reasoning, but where it's the formality that's involved is not so much to do with numbers. And actually an example of that is that logic has applications to, for example, theoretical economics, and they're not the kind that you might necessarily imagine. I mean, some of them are to do with the way that theoretical economics uses assumptions about what rational agents know and what they know about what other rational agents know, and what they know about what the others know about what the others know, and so on ad infinitum. Um, and it turns out that the best framework for studying those kind of issues about shared knowledge and common knowledge, which, as I say, are important for issues in theoretical economics and game theory, it is supplied by a branch of logic known as epistemic logic, which is a kind of has to do with formal models of knowledge. So that logic plays a role in sort of unexpected ways in helping to formalize areas of or other kinds of science where you wouldn't necessarily expect that logic was relevant.
Thank you very much, Tim. And another question is, what practical use is philosophy to humans who want to know how to conduct themselves?
Well, it it has all kinds of practical uses, often very unexpected ones. Of course, I mean, philosophy is not an instruction manual for life, and I think one should be very suspicious of people who just give you instructions for how to lead your life. Partly because you should ask how they know that these are good ways of leading your life. But it certainly enables one to reflect on the practical questions, maybe difficult questions, maybe moral dilemmas that one's in. I mean, maybe I can give a few examples to show the unexpected role of philosophy. So, I mean, in my own case, I know that my book Knowledge and Its Limits, which is a kind of quite abstract work on epistemology, I was surprised to meet someone who's working as a Christian missionary in Africa, and who told me that he'd used it in order to analyze the kind of conversations that he was having in his missionary work, and that he'd find it helpful for that reason. That, of course, was nothing. It was nothing to do with any of the reasons why I'd written the book in the first place, and I'm not even sure that I as it were, want people to be converted to Christianity. I mean, but certainly it had some kind of practical application for him. And another example from my own work is I wrote a little book called Tetralogue, which is kind of a very accessible book, but which is fundamentally a critique of relativism. And I met someone from California who told me that he'd read the book, and the effect it had on him was that he dumped his girlfriend because she was a relativist. And, I mean, now I don't know whether that was for good or bad, but that was certainly an effect that philosophy had on him. And just another example for the sake of it, is that I met a Danish graduate student who'd been hired by a restaurant in Copenhagen to be their house philosopher, and so he would go in every day for lunch. He'd get a free lunch, and sit at a table working. And if the waiter heard any people at a table getting into an argument with each other, he would come up to them and say, "Excuse me, we do have a philosopher available who might be able to help you with your argument." And very often they said yes, please, and he would come and join them. And in fact, some people started coming every week to the restaurant just so that they could have a conversation with the philosopher. So it was certainly of practical use to the restaurant, and I think maybe to the people whose arguments he was helping to clarify. I mean, his job was not to say who's right and who's wrong in these arguments, but simply to, as it were, to clarify what was going on. And
thank you very much, Tim. And I have another question on logic, and the question is about, I mean, the practical use of logic, and what practical use is logic to humans who want to know how to conduct their life, or maybe better, their scientific enterprise.
yeah, so it's. I mean, it's not likely to be really transformative for most people, but I mean, there is a branch of logic called deontic logic, which deals with the logic of words like ought and obligation and permission and so on, and it which turn out to have quite a rich formal structure. And so if you want to reason about moral or practical questions, but not so much just in an everyday way, but in just to reflect on very confusing situations, deontic logic is a good framework for doing that. And so, for example, deontic logic is probably the best framework for understanding moral dilemmas, where people face a conflict of duties. That whatever they do, they'll be violating at least one of their duties, and that kind of thing is it's very difficult to reason about in an informal way without getting oneself into contradictions. Whereas in deontic logic, you have exactly the structure that you need in order to reason carefully and consistently about those. And I think more generally, where one's looking for models of a simplified kind that that will, as it were, enable one to cut through some of the mess and complexity and get to the sort of underlying structure of what's going on in some problem. Um, of, I mean, sometimes what's involved are quantitative issues, and then logic is probably not the right tool to use for them. But sometimes, as it were, the difficulties are qualitative ones, and that what one is looking for is some kind of way of modeling a qualitatively confusing situation. And very often it's logic that has the kind of models that you need for that sort of problem.
Thank you very much again. And we can now move to the last part of our interview. And so we have I have two more questions for you. The first one, what do you think is the future of philosopher and the future of logic?
Well, so I mean, the first thing to say is that these questions about the future of an inquiry are inherently almost impossible to answer in detail, but and for a specific reason, which is what people sometimes say: if I knew the answer, I'd be there already. So, as it were, if you know, as soon as we're able to anticipate a development, we can actually do it. So that the I mean, it's different in in the area of technology where things can just be, even though we know that it's in principle possible to send human beings to Mars, there are all sorts of practical obstacles which mean that it will, may take many decades before that actually happens. But as we're in the pure intellectual world, once you have the fundamental insight, you can just get on working on it straight away, and so it means that, as it were, any kind of, as soon as a prediction can reliably be made, it will already come true. So we're not talking about the distant future anymore. But of course, the other thing which goes also leads to unpredictability is that the future of philosophy and the future of logic partly just depend on the future of civilization in general. And I mean, at the moment we're working in many places a very anti-intellectual climate, a climate which is hostile to reason. And although that hasn't yet stopped philosophy as an overall discipline, or that may have stopped individual philosophers, if things get much worse, then philosophy and logic are not going to as it were just be carrying on as usual. They may get taken down in the way that that philosophy and logic were affected by things like the fall of the Roman Empire and so on. And so those kind of issues. Although it's worth saying that in during the Second World War, which although that had effects on logic, and some logicians were murdered during the Second World War, in fact, philosophy and logic kept going pretty well even through an event as traumatic as that. But I don't think we should be complacent about that. But what I hope for is that the gradual development of more scientific forms of philosophy. Of course, I mean, who knows whether that will really come about? But I don't think that's inevitable. But I think there's a reasonable chance of that happening. I mean, at the at the moment, parts of philosophy have got very um, politicized, and I don't think that philosophers all have to stay politically neutral or anything like that. But I think if philosophers get too immersed in activism, although they may do heroic things, but philosophy itself doesn't have very much uh, of its own to contribute if one's not able to pursue it in an atmosphere that is conducive to reason. Um, but yes, I have hopes for where philosophy will go and fears, but not very much idea of whether it's the hopes or the fears that will be realized.
Awesome. And so I have last question. So imagine this video as a Dead Sea Scroll for future generations. If our posterities were to watch this video 1,000 years from now, what are the three most important things you want to tell them about your life and what you have learned?
Well, so if we think about the Dead Sea Scrolls, of course, it's not that they seem to have had huge amounts of wisdom to pass on to us, which have transformed our lives. So we've learned quite a bit from them about the development of various sects in Israel and Palestine, or as in and now other that we didn't otherwise know. And I mean, what I very much hope is that if I'm speaking to people 1,000 years from now, that they will know much, much, much more than we do. And what I would particularly like is that a lot of things that are now controversial in my books um, will seem pretty obvious to them, and they'll wonder why it was that they needed saying. But if I was going to say some things about myself, I mean, one is um, that I've always trusted my aesthetic instincts in theorizing. That the ugly views never turn out well in philosophy, um, and I mean, this is not something distinctive about philosophy. This is, of course, something that one finds in science and mathematics, that people are guided by an aesthetic sense. And as a special case of that, um, I I've always trusted classical logic with the law of excluded middle that I mentioned before as the simplest and strongest logic, and I think that has kept me safe from various superficial pseudo solutions to various problems in philosophy. Um, and it's a much more testing environment, one where it's much harder to be self-indulgent than in various non-classical logics. And I I would also say I think one of the most important things about humans, but in fact most animals, is that we're driven by an appetite for knowledge, um, and so that the category of knowledge is in fact central to human thought, even the thought of those who would vehemently deny that knowledge matters. And of course, that's been the theme of my epistemology. And I guess another theme in my work is anti-exceptionalism. So I want to I'm suspicious of claims made by any group that that they are very special. So I think philosophers are inclined to think that philosophy is special compared to the rest of science. And I've already said some things about why I think that's wrong. I think sometimes logicians want to cast logic in a very special role, and I think it's also much more similar to other forms of science than has been recognized by people theorizing about logic, and I also don't like exceptionalism about humans. Philosophers, for example, whose focus in philosophy is all just on humans, rather than recognizing that humans are just one more species amongst many, and that what we have in common with other species is probably more important than the ways in which we differ from them. And in fact, it seems to me that a quite a lot of human reflection has been utterly distorted by the fact that we're the by far the most intelligent species on Earth, but that's an accident of evolution, and we could easily have been living on a planet in which there were, a number of different species of roughly equal intelligence to humans, and I think that would have been very healthy for humans to have lived in an environment like that.
And thank you very much, Timothy, for your fascinating answers. And it was great to listen to your answer to my questions. And I thank you again for your time. And
Pleasure.
and I hope to see you in the future on other
Yes,
occasions.
yes, yes. Right. Well, thanks very much for doing that.